You mentioned 70% of men and some large percentage of women fantasize about murder. And I also read that you wrote that recidivism for homicide is only 1 to 3%. So that raises the question, why do people commit murder?
Murder is a really interesting crime because most of the time it's perpetrated for reasons that we don't like as a society. So, as a person who talks a lot to the news and also to producers who are trying to make true crime shows who don't necessarily have a deep understanding of psychology, let's just say, and who come at you with myths where you go, "Oh no, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about whether or not the mom is to blame for this person killing somebody." I hate that excuse. That's one of my least favorite sort of the trauma narrative of all people who do terrible things must have had a terrible childhood, I think is really problematic. What really happens in murder most of the time, which is not what you see on TV because it's really boring, is it's a fight that gets out of control. And if you look at the real reasons stated, it's things like this person owed me $4 and so I killed him. This person stole my bike. This person, I mean, it's these really stupid reasons. And it is just this bad decision in the moment, an overreaction to a fight, to an argument. And it wasn't planned. It's not some psychopath sharpening their knives, waiting for months to try and kill this person. And we don't like that because there's something called the victimization gap, which is that the impact of this extreme situation on the perpetrator, there's a huge gap between that and the impact on the victim and their family. So the victim loses a life, whereas the perpetrator, sure, they get imprisoned, but that at best, right, if you will, in terms of justice, but they don't have the same kinds of consequences. And we don't like that. We like things that have extreme consequences to have extreme reasons. And so that's why I think there's this real desire to show serial killers and to show people who are, in fact, planning murders for a really long time and then engage in them, rather than this fight that goes out of control or someone drink driving or someone who is, unfortunately, intimate partner homicide is also one of those situations that is common. One of the top 4 reasons for murder as well. But that's not the almost glamorized version that we see of murder online or that we see in the news. So I think it's always important to talk about murder as something that is rarely inherent to an individual. Very few people want to murder. They might fantasize about it, but they don't want to go through with it. And very few people who do engage in murder wanted to do it in that instance, never mind again. I think in general, we have the way that we look at lots of crimes upside down. So we put murderers in prison for a really long time because we think that that's justice, which is, sure, that's one version where it's an eye for an eye, kind of, life for life. There's obviously the more extreme version of that, which is the death penalty, which I don't adhere to, but I could see the rationalization of, well, you stole somebody else's life, so you don't deserve to have one. But there's also the other side, which is if we're looking at prevention, murder is really, like, people aren't going to go out and murder again. So that's a really low risk in terms of recidivism, actually. And high risk are things like fraud and elder abuse and sexual violence. And so in some ways, sometimes our sanctions are upside down in terms of how we can actually make society safer. And they're in line more just with how we perceive justice to work. So there's big fundamental questions about how we organize our justice systems and what we want them to be for.
Can you just linger on that a bit? So how should we think about everything you've just described for how our criminal justice system forgives? If they are very unlikely to murder again, how would you reform the criminal justice system?
I think forgiveness is up to the victims' families. And quite often when you speak with victims' families, there is this divide where you have some who are much more keen on something called restorative justice, which is where what they want is for the person to apologize, the perpetrator to apologize, to explain how it happened. Also, quite often, you look at some of the other consequences in the other context, it's sort of like teenage boys who are part of gangs, for example, is the other context. And it's a teenage boy killing another teenage boy. Like, these are kids. And the parents of a teenage boy understand that. This isn't, they don't think of this other perpetrator as this grown man who has, I don't know, I think we think of it as this fight between the parents of both teenage boys in that case. But really, often what parents want is to just understand how this could happen, and in some ways to allow the other teenage boy to still have a life and to not steal theirs as well or his as well. So there's that restorative justice model where forgiveness, I think, belongs to the families. Some families, of course, want the most extreme punishment. That's also, I can understand how that would be a response that's triggered if you've suffered a severe loss. But if we're looking to make society safer, putting people who've killed in prison is actually not the answer, right? Because if we want society to be safer, it should be based purely on what is most likely to deter crime and who is most likely to engage in it. And that's where I think we've got it upside down.